decolonization is becoming more and more of a word, but instead of dismissing that, you're finding it to be a really important opportunity because it, you know, like this idea of this mainstreaming decolonization, well, that's the point. You know, it's like taking it from the margins and bringing it more into the collective consciousness. And so thank you for it, you know, with the understanding that I know you're having a lot of these conversations. Thank you for having yet another one for the purpose.
No, they've been very fruitful. I'm honestly, it's very relational in the sense I've been learning so much from the questions and, you know, staying on with others, and then other articles, books that come up I haven't kept up, I haven't read, new scholars. So it's really building a, you know, transnational, relational. That's the only way to feel motivated, that you're part of a community, you know. And I've been increasingly feeling the need beyond just teaching, wanting to connect with scholars like you and Logan and others to see what they're doing, you know. Otherwise it feels very lonely, you know, like you're like solo just by yourselves doing this work, you know. You know.
What you were just saying there was really kind of obviously like the relationality of knowledge and how crucial community is and how that's a huge part of this work. And yeah, you know, I'm still pre-dissertation, but just thinking about like what that process is going to be like, and just that it's very like individual, like this is your project kind of thing, but then also making sure it's still grounded like in community and things like that, and how to keep up a community of scholars like who are all thinking about the same things and not just fall into this kind of like academic isolation, which I think the industry or whatever you want to call it really encourages. So that's been on my mind a lot for sure. So it's encouraging to know that, you know, more senior scholars are also thinking about these things, and it's validating, I guess.
Yeah.
So thank you.
So we can just orient to the SQIP newsletter. So Logan and I had thought about, the letter has always had this like research spotlight, and we thought it would be really nice to do it in pairs of emerging and established researchers around a certain theme. Also maybe to build that community, right? Like in the, like see that reflected in the newsletter itself is just a relationality coming together. You know, so where we asked Luigi things like, well, what researchers and scholars have inspired you as an emerging decolonial researcher? We might ask you, what do you have to say to inspire people like me and Luigi who are trying to do the work that you do? You know, so kind of build these connective bridges of community and mentorship around these themes. And so again, as you've been talking about decolonizing psychology, and I have your book, and I've been mostly focused for this interview on your methodology section. And that would be where we would be asking you more questions about, you know, because it's SQIP, the qualitative research, what's the connection there between decolonizing psychology and the role of qualitative inquiry in that? So we have about 4 questions that will follow around that concept.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The first question, just focusing it on research, is you wrote this book, it was published a couple years ago, Decolonizing Psychology, but it came from a very particular research question that you had asked. And so we were wondering if you could just kind of give a brief synopsis of that qualitative research project that led to the book.
Yeah. I think one way to start this conversation for me is to say that this has been something on my mind going back 20 years ago. So when I wrote my first article on decolonizing psychology, which was published in History of Psychology, and it was called Orientalism in Western or Euro-American and Indian Psychology, Representation of Native Others in Post-Colonial Context. And that's the my first attempt to think about ways in which colonialism has impacted not just the field, but the way the field has contributed to the project of colonialism. I wanted to hold psychology accountable for the ways in which it had constructed, theorized images of, I would say, my people from India at that time. Because I was noticing very early on in my readings, so the burning question, the animating question was very personal for me. I was very agitated. I had a lot of angst about reading materials 20, 25 years ago, where people of color, whenever they showed up, they were seen as having a deficient humanity, including people from South Asia. So either it was deficient humanity, or either they were caricatured, or either they were invisible and erased. So I was working with both the politics of location and the politics of representation. So that is the politics of location, meaning, who was constructing knowledge about African citizens living in decolonized societies and, say, in South Asia, and what was the representation of these citizens, these so-called subjects. And what I found was that in my looking at the archive of history was that it's not just psychology was deeply racist, but more and more it came to be seen as, more and more I discovered, investigated through archive, empirical evidence, ethnographic, textual, that it played a very big role in advancing the imperialist project. And that story had not been written up in psychology. So to me, that was my first attempt to, and the second piece of the attempt was what I would call, so there was the politics of location, politics of representation, and the third piece I would say was the politics of psychological colonialism, that is how it was internalized by South Asian, especially Indian scholars. So that article does both. It looks at the way European founders and scholars advanced this project, but also how it got internalized by Indian psychologists. Some of them actually were my teachers. And so it started there, and then it continued on in different spaces. And this book was a way to say that actually that article was mostly about the past, like over 100 years. And then when I kept going back to India and looking at the way psychological knowledge was being used continuously within corporations, within different parts of organizations, family, I thought this was a kind of neo-colonial turn occurring, that psychological imperialism was not just in the past, but it continues to happen in the present. And so while colonialism may be over, coloniality is what is taking shape in a post-colonial context. And so I was very interested in looking at what form does this new psychological imperialism is taking place, and who are the new subjects? How is this subject being theorized as such? So the context was neoliberalism and globalization as one way of looking at how psychological tools, psychological knowledge, psychological research methods were being somewhat continues to be exported in the guise of cross-cultural science, So psychological science had now become this interesting universal knowledge that no longer was being exported through all forms of colonialism, but new forms of colonialism or coloniality that I wanted to show and document, and how people take it up. So I just didn't want to theorize about it and say, here's an instrument, or here's MMPI, or here's multiphasic. I wanted to actually show communities in India, in a post-colonial society, the way it's being incorporated, it's being enriched, it's being given a new frame.
Yeah, that's really so kind of that broader burning angst. And then you described in your book going home and witnessing the ways that urban Indian youth were kind of talking about their lives.
Yes.
And across classes and
Mhm.
across genders, but so yeah, so I guess that's how you narrowed it down.
Right. So I narrowed it down by first, then it appeared to me that I wanted to what I was when I was going to APA, there were lots of conversations about globalization of psychology. So APA as a almost like a corporate entity, a mainstream, wants to um, spread its tentacles of knowledge across the world, like wants to give it away, as George Miller, one psychologist, said, we want to give psychology away to the world in this very benevolent form. But what was not being understood is a difference between, you know, the globalization of psychology versus the psychology of globalization. And I wanted to look at the psychology of globalization. What was underpinning it was basically a new form of neoliberal power that I actually say it's a new form of colonialism. And I wanted to then look at three communities within my hometown um, who were part of this neoliberal world and were very much, I would say, seduced by this psychological language of discourse. So let me give an example. So it started out because I was teaching in a university, a liberal arts college there in 2005, and I found the youth very taken up by certain discourses of liberation, of sexual liberation. These were 1821, but in that discourse, when I interviewing them, they spoke about this very interesting humanistic language of self-fulfillment, self-actualization, this very Silicon Valley type positivist psychology. So, I was looking at how did this psychology that was here in the US also become so hegemonic in a very local area, and how they knew the authors, they were reading the same texts, they were speaking the same interesting language. So I wanted to know this interesting transnational circuit around which this, and the more I investigated, examined, I found these discourses were not part of the new way of, what Gauri Pathak, she's a sociologist, talks a kind of neoliberal subjecthood. It's a new presentation of self. And in this new presentation of self, the elite upper class are kind of creating this, fashioning this new Indianness, so to speak. And so I wanted to investigate that and then do some comparative with other forms of Indianness that was much more middle class as such. And then it's like, I started out with looking at what I would call transnational upper class articulations of self that had material connection, that was connected to space and time. These upper class youth had the wealth to move about to Paris and New York and shop around here, and yet retain an interesting idea of Indianness, which they were not rejecting at all, but they were living in this interesting tension between, we could either call it modernity and tradition, but that might be one way to think about it. But what I was seeing is that they were trying to construct a new Indian subjecthood, which comes across as very cool when it travels across the world. And that became really important for them to tell me that, Indianness is not poverty. Indianness is no longer Orientalism. It's not about villages, but there was a way in which they were thinking of themselves as world-class citizens and were very invested in the idea that they needed to change the narrative of Indianness, which had even come to India, the new language of self.
I was just curious when you talked about that first article you wrote in History of Psychology. I was curious what the reception was like, both in the field broadly, but also, you mentioned you had particular mentors or professors, who were Indian, who you felt like were kind of embodying some of these problems that you saw. And especially as you were, I'm guessing an emerging scholar at that point, what it was like for that kind of critique of the field and of some of your senior colleagues, and like how that might be different from like the reception of your book now,
Right.
and how that would
Yeah.
translate to like younger researchers or more junior researchers rather.
That's a great.
Yeah, that's a very critical question. I'm glad you raised that. Uh, you could say that I was living, you know, a parallel life as an academic. One was trying to placate or play the so-called mainstream game is, we have to do to get a job, but I was not satisfied with it. So when I was writing, these were what I would call avocations of self-expression. It's like doing art on the side. I was writing, articulating these projects in diaries, but I didn't think they would ever come to fruition because I didn't know there could be a space in which I could bring history of psychology and look at historical analysis, because I was reading texts written in the 1850s, 1904, Dewey, Hall, Darwin, Spencer, and those were relegated to history. Nobody wanted to make that connection. It was being made in philosophy of science and history of science, but not in psychology per se, especially not in the psychology, even in cultural psychology or progressive forms of psychology. So when I was undertaking that project, what I found was, as I said, that there was both a coloniality or internal colonialism that I experienced in my professors back home who when I questioned what culture means or why aren't we talking about what's relevant to Indian youth? When I was a young person, relatively young person, they would discard that question and say, science is no way to talk about culture. You're going to contaminate the process of thinking. It was a very, especially at that time, the hegemony of science was very powerful for the new generation of I would call these were midnight children, meaning they were born in 1947, 1950, just at the point of decolonization was new and India's independence had just occurred. And they were very clear that the only way to survive in academia was to have to pay homage to American and British scholars. So it's not that they were somehow misguided or they were not intelligent but this idea of survival was very much linked to the global north as such. So while on one discourse they would tell me, this is okay, yeah, you can ask these questions about culture, family, Indian self, philosophy, but there is no space, you cannot do it, you'll not survive here, this is not how psychology is done. And so I left that psychology and I came to United States to pursue a different psychology. So when I was writing this article, I thought maybe they could be more open in the United States because they were talking about culture and narrative and new forms. But even there, to a large extent, I would say so. While narrative and culture was used, it was still within a European context. There was no way to frame or understand that from a post-colonial context. If you had to bring issues, say, from Kenya or Tanzania or India and so in both spaces, I found there was a lack of engagement as such with, I think, Nisha used the word marginalized communities and people who were living really much on the periphery. So when I published this article, first of all, everybody told me not to do so because, this is you're critiquing, you're young, you'll not get a job. That was one, but actually the reviewers were pretty harsh when I sent it out. So you could see it was split. But there were some reviewers who were very much against it because they thought I was painting a picture of the field that was putting a spotlight on its racist history and that we had moved on, and that I was calling out its racism, and now we are somewhat in a post-racial. So that was 20 years ago, and I have those reviews still with me. So it took me 18 months to work through these different reviews. And there wasn't much support I had either from my networks back home, because I was also critiquing them, their internalized colonialism, using some other psychologists who had made the claim, like Ashish Nandi. you know, he was a psychologist, but became a psychoanalyst and a cultural studies, you know, scholar, because he could not really tolerate being with in this Indian sort of psychology. So long story short, it was hard to do that piece from a knowledge production point of view because nobody wanted to touch it. I sent it to APA, American Psychologist. They told me it was too specialized and too multicultural, so send it to a ethnic psychology journal. So it's like, you know, this is their basic text was like, we are doing white psychology and you're trying to do some other psychology, so you can't. So I had no, so, and I sent it to some other journal. They rejected it too. So eventually, interestingly, History of Psychology was more willing to take it. So it says something about the discipline too, you know. So that's a piece. So to answer your question about reception, it's both. Producing that was tough because there wasn't a space, and the reception, I would say, was those who do critical psychology. It opened up, I would say, avenues to think about, you know, its racist history and its founder, how complicit they were. I also brought a lot of Edward Said in. So it was one of the first papers that brings in post-colonial scholars into psychology in a very constructive way, you know, especially Edward Said's work.
Logan, I might go veer a little bit off of the specific questions because this kind of what Sunil said just segues into maybe a new way to ask about your research again.
Yeah.
We wanted to ask, like, was there anything that surprised you about your research findings or process? But I might want to make that more specific to what you had said about critiquing Indians as well for the internalized colonization. Right. And as an, you know, I'm just thinking about narrative inquiry, right? I do phenomenological research and think that narrative inquiry is a very particular thing, and you kind of going in with a particular agenda about trying to understand the neoliberal self and how, you know, young Indian youth are seduced by how coloniality in present day. So what, can you tell us what that was like in your process of interviewing the participants with that lens and what you noticed there?
Yes. I would say, first of all, from a methodological point of view, the two places, to me, this was not that I would embrace a method that's different from theory. To me, method and theory were both highly ideological and political right from the beginning. So to me, I'd made certain choices. And one of the choice was that my own positionality as a third world scholar was living in the first world and then going back to India had needed to be really spoken. So the social situatedness was, I would say, the prime method for me in terms of understanding my question. Sort of who am I was very much connected to what I was investigating. I could not separate the two. And so my method is actually, although I do write about method in the end, throughout my book, I keep writing and coming back to where I was, you know, how I anchor myself, what I was seeing, both as a post-colonial scholar, but also as a subject of that country who had grown up in it and was revisiting it now with a little bit more power and a little bit more privilege. And what does that mean to come back? So for me, the struggle was, to answer Nisha's question, is how do I make home, which is so familiar, intimate, as object of study or subject of study? What does that mean? So it raised a lot of questions, ethical questions about, you know, who am I to make these judgments on internal colonialism of these youth, and what is the ethics of it? And especially when I was working with working class, urban, poor communities. I already had a project going for almost 10 years prior to that through a nonprofit organization that I had worked for, which was providing, and that's important because that was how I got to see what I was trying to do was three tales of of coloniality, or three tales of neoliberalism I was witnessing. So, I worked with working class communities, middle class communities, and upper class elite communities. And so in 2005, I was working with mostly upper class elite communities. In 2008, in order to understand the upper class, because this was my home, these youth were telling me that, no, you don't need to study us, go study the call center youth. This is where they kept referring to these other youth who were seduced by modernities, who were empty signifiers, who were lower in the hierarchy, and who had got caught up with the illusion of globalization, whereas they were the true subjects of globalization, the true modern liberated. So in my stories, they would keep talking about themselves as being truly transnational Indians, and understanding through their, in my questions, through focus groups, to, multiple interviews of going back and, I write a lot about walking the streets of India, publicly. Again, these are my home. This is where I grew up, where I learned how to bike, where I would take my Luna, go to, my moped, go to my college. So this idea of stepping in and stepping out of frames was very difficult and ambivalent. But my so-called participants were also confiding in me, or were really willing to speak about it, because nobody had approached them yet about, what do you make of this, of this new identity discourse you've adapted or embraced. And it was class-based. So one of the most difficult aspects, I would say, of the methodological piece from a qualitative perspective. What kind of so-called inquiries? So I prefer the word using inquiries, methodological inquiries, rather than method as a system, would lead me to understand these three different subjectivities in my hometown, in three different communities, how coloniality and neoliberalism is being resisted, reframed by these youth. And to me, a narrative exploration became very common, because it became very relational. Even before I would ask a question, they would tell me, here's a story I want to share about my friend, here's something I want to say. So in that sense, I had hundreds of youth. Project started in 2005 and ended in 2015. So I was doing this ethnography, an arc over. So I had met travelers, train passengers, rickshawalas, people in buses. So there were very formal consent form conversations here. Tell me, being very aware of my power, and if you're participating. And others were much more informal, because they didn't want to sign anything, and they were like, but others did too want to. So but a lot of what I was getting at that time methodologically from them was sort of they're making sense of what was going on. And I was becoming the kind of facilitator in terms of asking questions, probing, exploring. And this is where I would say my knowledge became very co-constructed and relational. And as they were telling more about their subjectivity, something became clear about my inquiry and my own subjectivity. And that's how the project evolved. So after I spoke to middle class youth who were doing accent training and who were, trying to interface with Australia and Australian customers, American customers, my city had like 11 call centers. 4 of my cousins had taken up these jobs of being call center workers, and all of them had English names, anglicized. So I was very curious, what is going on, why? And they put me in touch with other people and said, but you could see this kind of new form of colonization of English, becoming much more, a way to get social capital for even low working class people, sorry. So that became, so there were 3 stories that were connected to each other that I wanted to share and say, but at the same time, be very careful of the limits of who these individuals were, and connect it materially to their lives. So I just didn't want to leave it at stories. So I wanted to to give the audience, participants, readers a sense of, it's not just how they were speaking about their self, but what the material conditions were they were living in. So the questions also were directed with that in mind, methodologically. When I was speaking, so 2 or 3 instruments were very common. Individual interviews multiple times to get a story, clarify, come back, and then group, focus groups was another. And then I looked at websites, I looked at posters, I looked at housing and development that was occurring, what stories these advertisements, made. So space was very important at the same time.
Logan, anything coming up for you before I jump into a question?
I think we're good to go ahead. Thank you.
I think I'm adapting these questions as we go along based on what you're saying, and some of your phrasing in your book where you talk about field work versus homework.
Yes.
And you're talking about, in one sense, the methodological inquiries and the kind of areas of interest, but also the relationality and what was transforming in you in doing this. And so that would go to our last question. About the question was, in terms of decolonial work, what do you see as essential tasks or topics for a new generation of qualitative psychologists that are interested in doing this work, like myself? What advice would you have? But I might want to make that also more personal, which is that this is homework. And it is deeply personal, and it is also emotional. And you said it was born with angst, and there's the whole idea of like ethnography being research that breaks your heart, but also I think of it, maybe decolonial research as research that enrages you, and I guess I just wonder what advice you would have for people doing this work more newly or recently to kind of navigate some of that.
I think one place I think which is very fruitful is to really understand clearly that if you're taking on the project of decolonization and speaking about coloniality, we have to confront or ask still the question of how the field has been colonized. I think that project has not been yet done fully. We are just beginning it with the decolonial turn, so to speak. The decolonial turn has happened in other disciplines, but in psychology, it's very relatively new. So even before we go to coloniality, I'm in all my public presentations making this statement is, what do we know about colonization of the discipline? So how do we descent, before we descent or decolonize or unsettle theories, concepts, I think a greater project needs to be done in your own work to show how the space or the theories you're working with or the very subject you're working with has been colonized or has been seen through the colonial model of knowledge production. And when I mean colonial model, not just going to 1920s or 1930s, when that is one past, but even recently, even through the lens of science, for example. What are the ways in which structures of coloniality have asked questions of gender and race and how we, as those subjects, we breathe that coloniality and power of colonialism, but we haven't investigated that. So I think we need much more work that speaks to unraveling, showing in some ways, what I would call influences of coloniality have occurred at what points, in say your dissertation or a book you're working on. If it's truly a decolonial project, that's one. So we need to do the mapping, and that mapping needs to be done because that speaks to the idea of structural decolonization. Somewhere along the lines, our new work has to speak to how we are, what Walter Mignolo calls delinking. Part of the decolonization is delinking from all forms of knowledge. So a lot of South African scholars are speaking about delinking by looking at indigenous ways, new ways of thinking, new ways of articulating, hybrid ways of, knowing, feeling, in the way that Linda Tuhai Smith and others have spoken about. So to me, that's the second piece that's really critical, is to understand, if you're making claims about structural decolonization, first tell us about how it's been colonized, and then show what are those structures. Mm. And third, I would say, is the, epistemic kind of decolonization, which is, Sabelo Nadwelu Gastani, a South African scholar, speaks about epistemological decolonization as a precondition for structural decolonization, meaning they go hand in hand. And that is the only reason why countries, much of the world, got colonized was not because there's a desire for territory. Behind that desire for territory was also, I think Said's work is very important. There was an army of workers, of anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, who created these knowledge systems that brought us these frameworks. So anthropology, psychology, a lot of modern disciplines have been born at the peak of European colonization. So, and those frameworks are still with us. We haven't gone, to other philosophies, other ways of thinking, and so on. So to me, that is another piece. Others have called it epistemic decolonization, moving away from epistemicide, tackling sociology of absences, De Santos. There are other scholars who've been. So to me, that's the piece I would say. So a third piece would be, is how do you undertake in your understanding, providing new ways of thinking that are not just reinforcing the same theory. So I mean, one may use feminist narrative approach, but is it truly decolonial? Because in some ways you can still reinscribe or reproduce the status quo by saying, so to have some understanding of what true, I mean, I won't say that scholars have to stamp like this is true or not true, but ways in which it's pushing the discipline to decolonize itself. So that's the third, the only final one, if you have space, I would put it forth as personal or, relational decolonization. Like, how are you engaged in your personal lives with in projects that, to me, it's a decolonial praxis. So meaning, well, what are the ways now, whether it's climate change, whether it's, whether you're living in an urban neighborhood, what are the ways in which this is happening personally? How do you see, that work, I think, is equally important. And that's where I'm very inspired by Fanon and Nandi. Fanon has been my inspiration for the personal decolonial, work. He speaks about the needing a new humanity, a new humanism, because colonization is total, according to him. So if you have to create something new, then you also need this personal decolonization that has to happen alongside the structural piece as well. And in some ways, I find as a psychologist that the hardest, because there's no support system. We don't have advisors, or we don't have systems that tell us how to engage relational, because neoliberalism creates competition, and we are trying to outdo each other in terms of grants and publications and solo awards. And so I think personal decolonization can only happen if, in some ways, we are refusing the university or something. So it's like your personal cannot happen unless you decolonize the university too, because that's the arm where all this knowledge is occurring. And so if that's colonial, then you are out of the game. Like, how do we change all of this? So I would say that would be, from a method, to me, all of this is method and theory. I don't see any of this as outside the realm of methods. All the stuff that I'm talking, these are not theories to me. These are methodological moves that one can make towards personal, mutual, structural, epistemological. That's what I'm working with these days. That is, how do we, decolonize? The university systems were a very important arm that created the colonial project, and we still continue to inherit the legacies of that in our systems.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about like shifting that hierarchical way we relate, you know, like how does and academia perpetuating it, and it's a complete a shift in being in the world, you know, to be phenomenological about it, but I really appreciate that. Yeah. And challenging it, like you know, how we, if we do it differently, it is shifting the worlds we're living in, you know?
Yes, and I think here we can learn from movements that have taught us, community-based movements, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's Roads Must Fall, you know, in South Africa, and, you know, the new Dalit resistance in India that's happening. So these are all places that can also, so that's the way, because we don't find ways to connect with community the way they're doing all this work. So that's what I'm working on these days, is to figure out ways to bring to break this binary between academic knowledge and community knowledge. And I think that's probably the in terms of methods, you know, I mean, think about post George Floyd moment. What methods did they use? What methods are they using to change our systems? I mean, those methods are about consciousness, about protest, about resistance, right? Getting together, being in a public square, challenging, you know, and that method also has different implications for risk, you know. So I think we need to figure out what is the so when we're trying to bring change in the field, talk about coloniality, who's at risk in here, you know? You know, is there a safer way to do it? Whereas what we are seeing today, a lot of youth outside, and I don't want to romanticize this, but all I'm saying is that we definitely have to pay attention to also like anti-colonial, anti-racism is different from psychology. I mean, there's a psychology of anti-racism and anti-coloniality, but that sometimes is actually goes completely opposite to what we define as psychology as a field, which is, you know, has a very, very specific agenda of how to create knowledge. And even this conversation, qualitative, narrative, feminist, is very much on the margins. I mean,
I think with what you just said, kind of, you know, and then a few minutes ago you had said, you know, that this decolonial work really requires, I think you said rejecting the university maybe, or uncoupling from the university, or something like that. And kind of similar to what you just said with psychology, just like thinking about exactly what that looks like in terms of, you know, if you completely reject it, then you're outside of that system. And so you won't be influential in that system.
You're right.
You know,
that's why I said I'm struggling with it.
But then how do you deal with that, right? If you're still a part of it, you still are employed by a university, et cetera, right. You're still publishing. How do you maintain your value?
Yeah, and that's why I make those claims with a lot of asterisks and somewhat disclaimers. And I'm glad you pointed that out, because I'm a product of that. I know I'm able to bring my work because to some extent, you know, I played by those rules, so to speak. But I think when we are dismantling unsettling systems, I mean, and creating new, you know, systems, I think at some point, this is not an individual's effort. That's where we can see, and that's why when we look at massive changes that have happened through social justice movements, it's when particular ideas were taken up by society because a small group of individuals were willing to move something further, whether it's the Me Too movement, whether it's the civil rights, or whether just the decolonization movement happened in Asia in the 1960s when all the states became decolonized. So there's a decoloniality which is separate from, in terms of the Latin American context and the decolonization movement, which I get my inspiration from the African and Asian states in the 1960s that were trying to decolonize. They did not want to, they met in 1955 in a place called Bandung Conference to neither align themselves with the Soviet model or neither align themselves with the American capitalistic model, and they called themselves the non-aligned nations, and part of it was to kind of create a new way of thinking about the universe, a new way of thinking about knowledge, a new way of thinking about livelihood. And the three parts of their struggle or their vision of the self was bread, justice, and peace. As part of decolonizing the world, like these would be three pieces that we would need to give our citizens: bread, justice, and peace. And these were leaders that arrived themselves and said, we are not going to be influenced by this power block that we call the so-called first world, or the European, Euro-American, or then the sort of more the socialist communist bloc, but what are ways in which we can so I think we have models that we can go back to, but I think that's a challenge. I don't have a very specific answer to yet. Where do you go to create a space that gives you the livelihood but yet allows you to construct this knowledge that's outside the so-called university? I think the most important work that's happening within settler colonialism, with Native studies, where they're really looking at revitalizing traditions, I think that work probably is going to define for me. That's probably the most productive work in terms of completely rethinking academia that's happening right now. That is because they are really challenging, how university reproduces settler colonialism. And they have to think about where else can we go to figure out, thinking that's connected to land and water. And so I think we have to be inspired and learn from the new projects of resistance to settler colonialism that's coming out of indigenous, whether you want to call it indigenous political theory, Native studies, either from the US imaginary or the Australian or the New Zealand Maori. You have ways in which they are thinking about community, self, knowledge. So that's one. You also have within the context of India right now, where there is interesting ways to think about indigeneity from a kind of caste point of view, Dalit, ways of thinking about self and knowledge and so on, like reclaiming or recovering. And then in the post-apartheid context right now in South Africa, you have probably in psychology, I would say, the most fertile work being done in decoloniality and decolonization right now. There are about 20 big scholars, important foundational scholars whose work I follow, I'm inspired by, because they are really, really putting work out there of what it means to. So there are some models. We're not yet there fully, but germs are being planted. Seeds are being planted.